Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you, Linda. Thank you to the staff. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I love doing local things here in Baltimore. A little about me, I have all the degrees in composition, as she mentioned, through my teachers. And I spent a lot of years adjuncting in composition, music theory, musicology, giving private composition lessons around here, Peabody, University of Baltimore. And in 2014, I taught the freshman composition seminar at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which is a fond memory. And now I'm at the University of Baltimore, which is a school that has what we call a non-traditional population. It's a majority minority school, average age about 28 for undergraduates. And so the program I direct is very much a generalized arts program for people interested in the arts and interested in the arts industry. And I'll talk about how that informs what I'm going to say in a little bit. This is part of a longer article that actually just came out in the Tempo Journal, which you can access and which I can send a PDF to anyone who's interested in. And I'm going to sort of take out the main points from it, but I'm happy to take any questions for elaboration afterward. So this started when Leeds University convened a bunch of people to talk about teaching composition in the 21st century and what the unique challenges were. And for me, it seemed like when I thought about the challenges right now, it seemed like composition is being pulled in a couple kind of different directions. From the right, figuratively and literally, we have the pull of what skills are you learning, how are you going to get a job, what use is this music, not just in broader society, but to our university. I'm someone who's had to do a lot of program prioritization documents, which is one of the horrifying things about being in academia. But from the left, we also have, your genre has become hegemonic, it is too white, it is too male, we need to adapt, we need to open it up to marginalized communities. And that, I think, kind of pulls in different ways, because on one sense we have, you have to tell me exactly what you're doing and learn stylistic and genre skills in order to be able to be competitive in a marketplace. On another side, we have to have maximum openness and maximum inclusivity and adaptability, which can pull our minds in two different ways. And so the questions I asked myself about what I'm doing as a composition teacher is, am I training students in a field that practically guarantees precarity? If so, can I teach in a way truly valuable beyond just employment prospects? And if music departments are to diversify beyond new music or art music, can I teach rigorous and relevant composition practice to students specializing in genres different from mine? Can we create equitable departments of experimental music that are generalized enough to include a variety of marginalized creators, but rigorous enough to give us pride in our pedagogy? And so there's three techniques or tactics I'm going to talk about today. The first is explicitly teaching different levels of creative thought. I'll talk about what that means. The second is explicitly, I'm going to use that word a lot probably, teaching the creative process, the same way that we teach creativity or composition or harmony or anything like that. And the third is to have more formalized interaction laterally between students and not just rely on the bar to be the place where our students get ideas from each other socially, although there's space for that as well. So as Jessica mentioned, I'm a student of Chaya Chernovin, which some of you will know means that my training is entirely steeped in metaphor, which means that it was extremely an opening thing for me to have my piece described as, you see a man's face and then you zoom out and he's standing on one leg, and then you zoom out and he's standing on a table, and then you zoom out and the table is shaking. That to me was everything I needed at a certain time to get confidence and ownership over my music, to be able to explain every note and have an idea of why I wanted to be making it. But of course, not just for Chaya, but at a lot of the places I attended, a lot of the master classes I went to all over the world, I noticed that composers seem to talk to each other in this kind of middle level of creativity. We talk to each other about what we wanted this phrase to be like, what process we wanted to explore in this piece, how we wanted things to develop. And we very rarely talked about why we're writing this piece to begin with on one level, or on the other level, what harmonies I use to create this effect, what my orchestrational philosophy is to morph this phrase or something like that. And so I started to hypothesize these kind of levels of creative thought, the middle level being where I think a lot of, at least in my training, compositional discussion has. questions of desired affect, emotional content, phrase morphology, aesthetic goals for individual pieces. But as I sat in those seminar rooms, I often found myself wondering, why are we all doing this? Are we all doing this for the same reasons? What good does our work do in the world or to ourselves? Probably should call it the bird's eye level, get away from these value judgments. I did that for the low level and changed it to the ground level, where that's, questions of why aren't we talking more about, I know that we're trying to avoid stylistic specificity. That's another part of the condition of composition right now. But of course, that just generates its own stylistic kind of vernacular. Why aren't we talking more about literally harmony, orchestration, things that tend to be kind of farmed out to other classes taught by specialists who may not be composers, which is not a bad thing, but that kind of seems to segregate it off from conversations of composition. Speaking on the ground level for a second, I think one of the fears, of course, is that when we start talking about skills, we're going to start to talk about marketability, what you can do with your skills to get a job after school. And I am, believe me, just as allergic to that kind of rhetoric as a lot of composers are. I do not think that universities should become places where we do job training for corporations for free. And I do think it should be a place separate from the market for experimentation, progressivism, decolonization, all these important things to take place. But one thing that I've developed as a teacher is the idea that I think sometimes making the scary thing explicit actually opens up space for creativity in people. Rather than focusing on the middle level of creativity and teaching creativity, if we can talk openly about skills that can or should be developed, which of these skills are just useful for you to have as a person or as a musician, which of those overlap with skills that are useful for you to have to make money, which is something everyone has to do at some point. I think putting those explicitly in these sort of containers can actually relieve a lot of pressure on a student and open up space for them to have that open experimental mindset that I think we try and cultivate by focusing too much on that middle level. At the high level, this is something I've thought a lot about as I've been teaching these classes at University of Baltimore, because in these classes, I am very likely to be teaching a music class to a room of students that contains someone who played violin for 18 years and went to Peabody and dropped out and came to the University of Baltimore, and also someone who's never thought about music once in their lives in the same classroom. And so it was a challenge for me to think about what techniques and material to present to people like this. And I found that it really forced me to define for myself what was important about art, what it is, in a way that I can explain both to the seasoned person and to the novice, and ultimately in a way that I could explain to myself. And it had a massive effect, I think, on how I write music, and the reasons I write music for. In these seminars and master classes and the things I was talking about earlier, where I felt like there was a lot of this middle level rhetoric, I feel like the assumption was that we were all at the concert for the same reason, or that we all wanted to go to the concert, or that, and so if we start from there, then we'll get into the meat of creativity. But I sort of want to say, what if we didn't assume that? What if we had conversations that maybe became a little uncomfortable as people revealed themselves to have quite different motivations for writing music than the other people in the room. But I do think that would, for me anyway, it helped me place a lot more stake in what I was doing, which I guess is a pressure situation that can flummox some people. But for me, it kind of got rid of the, for lack of a better word, BS surrounding my compositional practice and my worry about whether what I was doing was good music. And I started to worry more about whether what I was doing was impactful for me, in a sort of, not to use a word from the advertising industry, but like abruptive way, in a way that makes people stop and take notice, or at least for me. So, the next thing I want to talk about is teaching the creative process explicitly. This is something, advice on where creativity fits into your life, on what your routine should be for writing every day, or how long, or what time of day, and all that sort of thing. I feel like this was maybe one of the most important things for me to nail down to feel comfortable with my practice as a composer, and I learned it almost entirely from my peers. From people saying, I wake up every morning and I write for 10 minutes before I brush my teeth, and that makes it just so much easier to come back through the day, even just that little bit. Or the importance of a clean desk. Or, again, as a student of Higher Chernobyl, every time you sit down, if you're writing from left to right, you must read from the beginning to where you are in real time, every time, to properly orient yourself to the piece. But again, this is something sort of tossed off in a lesson rather than the meat of the lesson itself. The other thing that gave me perspective on this is that I'm an adult learner of a musical instrument. I've been learning the oud for about 10 years. And as someone who kind of tossed off practicing as a high schooler, which is one reason I went into composition, it's been very helpful to sort of revisit the discipline of learning a musical instrument as an adult. For a couple of reasons. One is learning that it is, more than anything else, a physical discipline. You are not going to a teacher to have them tell you how to play this instrument. You're going to have them remind you, my teacher literally takes a bow and taps where the tension is on my body, but remind you that learning to sit, learning to hold, is a practice that takes years and is just as important as any knowledge. And secondly, that the proper routine is absolutely necessary in order to be able to learn how to sit, learn how to hold, and train your muscles, train your body to be disciplined with that instrument more than anything else. And without doing too much linguistic work, I think you can take that and pick it up and place it directly down onto compositional practice. I think making art is a muscle memory that is trained as much as a musical instrument is. I have a colleague at University of Baltimore, the poet Stephen Leva, and we're always getting in these discussions about what an artist is. And his hypothesis is that an artist is someone who in 2022 can sit down with the couple spare hours they have and make art. In that time. That's what the particular talent of an artist is in our society. And so that ability, I think, is something that can be taught explicitly. Again, my teaching in a sort of general education setting gave me some techniques for this. I've taught for a couple of years in Jessup Correctional Institution near here in a prison program that University of Baltimore runs. And things are better now, but when I started in the program, there was no internet, barely any library, no contact with the students except for the once a week I went in. And so I'm thinking, what project can I develop that will be a learning experience, even if you literally can't leave your room or if you have just the materials that you have access to. And I should point out that these students had the exact same characteristics that my students at UBalt have, which is some of them are extremely accomplished artists and extremely good at talking about it, and some of them have never touched it or thought about it a day in their lives. And so this project I developed, which I've been using in a lot of classes now, is called the Creative Process Project, where basically I'm asking them to create a small artwork of any kind, even if they've never done it before. A poem, a song, a drawing. I pretty much take all comers, whatever people suggest. They're not graded on how good the artwork is, obviously. That part of the assignment is just a yes or no on did you try to do it, because also screwing it up is an important part of the creative process. One student said, I'm going to try and cheat, and I said, I actually think I've designed a project that you cannot cheat on, which I'm very proud of. And then as they go along, I've given them this kind of loose schedule for basically journaling alongside the creative process and asking themselves these questions that I think some sneak up to the high level, my own vocabulary, some sneak down to the ground level, and just get a person contemplating, first of all, how this changes their day to be doing something like this every day. And second of all, how it plays in their life. Is this something that feels good in a weird way? Is this something that feels very bad in a weird way, which is obviously a possibility as well. And again, I think one thing that I like about this project is I think that if you've never done artwork before, that you can get a lot out of it. And I think if I ever sat down and did the project, that I would get a lot out of it. And someone who is an expert would get a lot out of it as well. The next project I developed for a class called Technology and the Arts, if you can imagine a more broad topic for a class. And pretty much all of my classes have titles like this, so it's really up to me. Again, in this class, you have people who are whizzes at artistic technology and people who never touched it before. Guess which category I tend to fall into, and I'm the professor. Ooh, there's my notes for what to do next time. Let's move that up. And here, again, I'm thinking of an information ecosystem where we have now where there is so much you can learn on YouTube, which is not the case when I was in college. And so, again, if college is going to justify the cost that we're charging the students, if we're going to be adding something that they can't just learn on YouTube, and if I'm not going to be up there being able to teach this one Photoshop and this one Reaper and this one Premiere or whatever it is, I'm thinking the project is basically how to use that ecosystem, how to train yourself to find the appropriate resources and develop in yourself a discipline for using those resources that will be useful when the technology changes completely in 5 years when you're outside of school. So it's a kind of similar thing. Pick, any kind of technology. And for this project, I, encourage them to think beyond the sort of digital for the technology. Some people have done calligraphy. A lot of people do some analog stuff, which is good. And it's a similar thing, it's just a very basic yes or no, like, okay, I want to learn this technology. Do I have it? Can I get it? And I have them go through and make a kind of, I call it a resource roundup, where they're basically making a one-page guide for the next person who comes along in their position. This YouTube channel sucks, this one is good, this Reddit forum is full of Nazis or something, and this one is actually helpful, just to save time for people doing this kind of thing. And of course, this comes along with bringing in the librarians and talking about what's a reliable source and all that sort of thing. And so here, I think, obviously, this speaks a little bit more to my ground level idea of, it might not be, if I'm teaching a student who makes music completely different to mine or is in a totally different style, I might not be in a position to actually teach them the particular skill that they need to learn. But I think I can become an expert in gathering that information with the resources the university has, especially if it is buttressed by the immense resources, at least for now, that we have via, this makes me sound really old, but via the internet, the wonders of the internet. So the last bit, the last technique I want to talk about is formalized interaction. I did a summer academy at Schloss Solitude, and one of the highlights of that is that every student has to meet every other student one-on-one at some point, which at age 22 is a little bit more of like boxing out and raising eyebrows at each other than anything useful, but this is another thing that you practice over time. At the beginning of the lockdown, I wanted to raise money for some of these artist mutual aid funds, and I put a call out, like, I'll give anyone a composition lesson, and I'll donate the equivalent of the fee to this mutual aid fund. And I received a lot of requests from peers, like people who are not people I would teach, who just wanted to talk on Zoom about what questions we had about our practices for an hour and a half, and then we donated money to this mutual aid fund, and it was extremely helpful in a way that I think is quite different to doing it socially over a beer, or quite different to doing it in a setting like this with other people watching you. Another thing I did that really opened my eyes was I collaborated with the electronic musician Bonnie Jones, and we were going to do a project together, but Bonnie is an electronics improviser with this very specific toolbox. I am a composer who makes my scores in Google Docs. And so we basically gave each other these kind of private artist talks, like what I'm doing here, but like one-on-one, here's my toolbox, here's what I do, here's what I was really going for in this section. Really going for in a way different to what I would say in a masterclass situation, I would think, by the way. And I think that is a level of intimacy that, again, is not necessarily achieved if we just leave it up to socialization. And again, this is the kind of thing that I think speaks to composition vocationally, which is kind of the word I've come up with to bridge that gap between adaptability and marketability or skills-based teaching, is that composition is a practice that you must go after diligently, that you must develop skills for, that you must develop a routine for. But if you go out there and you can't get a job at it, I think, first of all, you should be able to let it go. And second of all, it should not necessarily ruin music for you, which I think not talking about this stuff can sometimes do. And so I'd like to end by just reading the last little bit of this paper. In 2017, I lay on my couch, arm over my eyes, ready to be done. It was my 4th year of being an adjunct professor, which can pay as little as $2,500 per course with no health benefits or future prospects. I was over this lifestyle. I was ready for a 9-to-5 job. I didn't want to deal with the precarity of academia anymore. But I was reacting against the job, not against composition or being a composer. In fact, I argued to my partner that taking a 9-to-5 job would actually improve my composer life by decoupling it from academic job anxiety. I was lucky enough to be hired for the job I now have soon after, but if I had left academia, I don't think I would have seen my training as a waste. The fact that we in US universities must constantly justify our existence to university administration makes it hard to talk about the fact that what we're training people for might not exactly be a job. As I examined the social role of composition in new music, I found things that I could practice no matter how circumstances shifted, that would always enrich my life: physical discipline, artistic community, liveness. As we work toward industry conditions that dismantle those oppressive structures, we can also be explicit about the high level and the ground level, about discipline, practice, and skills, and about the fact that you are developing a vocation that may or may not end up being a career. We can serve students well, if only in terms of self-knowledge and constructing a supportive community for when they will need it in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you to all my vigorous nodders out there. As all of you teachers know, it really helps you go through.
Well, thank you for a wonderful talk. We have some time for questions. Does anyone? Yes.
Yeah, so when you sort of presented your lesson plans for the Learning Curve project and the Creative Process project, it was very clear that, and you talked about the circumstances that led to this, but you were casting an incredibly wide net about what is appropriate for artistic practice. And, ooh, a microphone.
Cool. Is this working?
Yes.
Awesome. So you were casting this really wide net, and I found just as a student that sometimes, like, what I really need is just a lot of specificity about what I'm going to work on next. And I was feeling like there was tension between needing to cast a super wide net and also needing to help people through like very specific questions about what do I work on and how do I work on it. So I was wondering just how have you navigated sort of transitioning between needing to talk to everybody about everything and needing to talk to one person about what they are doing?
That's a really good question. It's one that I struggle with a lot as a composer. I'm someone who, when you give me a set of instruments, I have a concept immediately. But when you give me a grant application that says, come up with anything you want to do, no idea. I think one thing we need to do is accept that you're gonna not remember most of what you learn in college. Or at least that's been the case for me. And I don't mean at all to say that college is not impactful or not worth it. I mean to say that there are things that you can only learn by thinking about them for 10 years. And as a composition professor, I mean, this is a kind of a cop-out answer, but I try and strike a balance. I try and push where I can, but ultimately, one thing I will say that I do is, I try to discourage in a positive way. And what I mean by that is it's very fashionable to tell students now that going to grad school is a waste of time, you will not get a job, you'll ruin your emotional life, etc. And believe me, I was told the same thing about going into music when I was 18. And what I thought at that time was, no, it won't, not for me. And then it kind of was. But the point is that that's not what a student who's enthusiastic about something wants or even necessarily needs to hear. I think that you can I mean, this is a challenge, but that you can prepare a student for lack of a new word, precarity of either music life or academic life in a way that builds upon their desires rather than attempts to negate their desires, in the same way that you can't negate history. So in terms of suggesting a student do anything, whether it be specificity or breadth, or taking a break from composition or not taking a break from composition or something like that, which seems to be what comes up more often, to be honest with you. I think I tend to give more listen-toable advice if I am remembering that I'm just a small part of this student's life, and that they're going to go off and have their own life, and I just got to be okay with that. Maybe that was an answer that was too focused on me, but that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you.
Someone in the back. Yeah.
One way, yeah. That was the second.
Hey, can you hear me? Yeah. Hi. At the beginning of your talk, you said something that'd be great to tease out, which is, I'm looking up at your slide, inclusivity and decolonization. And it seemed like you were saying, in today's times, that's challenging to standards. And I wonder if you want to tease that out more, because for me that was a little problematic, that juxtaposition. Mm-hmm. So what did you mean by it for you? Thank you.
I mean, I will say, as a person, it's challenging because I have anxiety that I'm just going to be fired. That, you know, I have a very specific training in this extremely hegemonic genre, and that we, in order to decolonize the academy, we need to, for example, replace all the current faculty, which, if that is the case, I think is just something that has to be embraced. If, according to the realities of either tenure or the labor market or the continued dominance of white supremacy, we do not replace all the faculty, I think that there are techniques that can be learned to continue to open composition teaching, creative practice teaching, to genres that have not been so historically hegemonic. I think that there are strides being made. One thing I mentioned in the article is that, you know, the artist Moormother was just hired by USC, which is a big deal, not just because a person who is not traditionally new music was hired, but because she was hired as a professor of composition. And I've lived through a lot of non-new music people being hired in order to diversify the academy, and then they're professor of creative practice or professor of critical studies and improvisational practices or whatever it was. And I think that composition now needs to encompass more than just the new music or experimental music fields. But no matter who you hire to fill those faculty roles, in order to continue to be open to genres that have historically been marginalized, you're going to be talking about people teaching people in different specialties than they have. That's all I mean, I think, is that like a truly inclusive academy means students who are there to learn something that not a professor there cannot necessarily teach. And so how can we do that rigorously, I think is what I was talking about there.
I'm just taking in what you're saying.
Sorry.
It sounds like it's a larger conversation. Maybe we'll hear more about this as we go along.
Yeah, I mean, it is a long, it's a very long conversation. I know, you know, just having been to, I was leaving Harvard right around the time that they completely uprooted their music curriculum to no longer be centered on Western classical music. And believe me, there were dogfights in the faculty meetings about that. But I just think also, as people like me who have historically benefited from this hegemonic genre, our job is to kind of like go along for the ride and take what comes and be respectful and willing to adapt and willing to change.
I also just want to speak to that because I think in some ways our students are learning and doing music outside of the academy for the most part. And to the extent that we can bring that in and enable its performance, you know, so here, for example, we have students bringing their bands in to do their senior recitals, right? So that music, so not saying that music is not part of the academy, that's part of their musical lives. And perhaps we shouldn't be teaching it to them because they're learning it very well on their own. So, and that on that level, I think you know what you're proposing can easily be handled by simply being accepting of the fact, the fact of our students' lives anyway.
Yeah.
Right?
I wouldn't want it all to be handled by an informal economy.
No. I'm not saying so.
I think you can look at
either,
literally the dollar amounts and how they're distributed to see how fairly genres are being accepted by the academy.
I see. Yeah, that's a longer conversation, but just wanted to insert that. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, I just want to kind of go back to something a bit earlier.
Bradley, we're using a microphone because we're recording sessions for people that couldn't be here, so thanks.
I can use the microphone, I can do that. So I want to go back to the vocation thing and the job training thing as something that's very close to my heart for reasons I won't get into here because I'm sure we got to prep for the next presentation. But there was a presentation done a couple years ago, and this is of course just a very small sample, that I was a part of, and it was about alumni from this particular school, graduate school, and they asked the students, what was one thing that you felt your graduate school could have done better? And across the board, it was career prep. So I was just wondering, kind of like, obviously separating the skills from, your job as a career, but also you made a mention of kind of students can already be knowledgeable about the difficulties they will have in their career afterwards. And I'm not sure if that's actually 100% the case. It depends on where you go, obviously. So I was just wondering if you could speak more to that. Like, in your own program, what do you consider to be career prep for your students if you do that at all?
What I consider, we have classes called The Business of Being an Artist and Essentials of Arts Management, and those help. But to me, the career prep in our program is the mandatory internship and the mandatory capstone project, where you pitch a project to an organization and go out and do it. Teaching career prep in the academy is tricky because, first of all, I was an 18-year-old thinking career skills was the stupidest class I had to take, and doodling and laughing with my friends in the back of it. And from roaming the halls of Peabody, it doesn't seem like 18-year-olds have changed that much in that regard. But also because just things change. It's probably just the widest, also different perspectives people have. I mean, how do you fold the fetishization of busyness and work into career prep? Because you're going to have tenured professors telling you have to take every opportunity, you have to do this, you do this, and do this, and you have others saying, take time for yourself, reserve time for yourself. And I just think I'm not trying to cop out and say it's one of those things that has to be learned on your own or something like that. But I do think it's something that I think each professor should speak to it from their own perspective, be completely honest, maybe like a journalist, that it is very much from their own perspective, and that the only way to learn how to write a grant is to write a grant or to read a bunch of grants. That's the other thing. I should say every grad student should be able to sit on a search committee, because nothing changed my cover letters like being on one of those committees and seeing how completely random that process is. And so I think little things like that would really help. One quick anecdote. For this paper, I interviewed a friend of mine who did composition with me in undergraduate, and then went on to do a master's in jazz arranging at a very famous conservatory that I won't name in Rochester, New York. And he, as a composer, wanted to, they had a big orchestral reading project, and he wanted to do an original piece for it. And he was told, absolutely not, under no circumstances are you going to do an original piece, you have to arrange something. And he begrudgingly arranged this Piazzolla piece, and he told me, you know what, I got so much work off of that Piazzolla piece because the people listening to it weren't judging two things at once. Now, at that skills-based, I bring this up because that's a completely skills-based program, not a middle-level creativity-based program like the ones I'm used to. But he said, we didn't learn a thing about career prep. And honestly, the thing that has helped me most in my career is eagerness to take on work and to learn on the job and do it with a smile. And now he's doing it all over New York, all over the time. And so I think we also need to not overplay how much you can learn in a university in terms of how to organize your life around it. But that's another challenge. Thank you all very much for your questions.